Hello, everyone. Welcome. I hope you are ready because we are about to go on a little quest together. And you might be asking yourself, a quest for what? We will definitely get to that. But before we do, I wanted to just introduce myself and the other folks you see on video here. So I'm Jessica Bosenko. I'm a senior vice president at M&R. I would say my favorite quest is the Never-Ending Story, which I just finally got my children to watch. The original, I will also add. Carla, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and share your favorite quest?
Sure. Hey, I'm Carla Capers. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Do you want me to explain who UCS is now, or should I save that for later?
Go ahead. I think you can go ahead and do that now.
Okay. We are a science-based advocacy organization. We've been around for about 50 years, and we use science to figure out solutions to issues related to the environment, food, security, a range of issues that we work on. And I oversee all things marketing for the organization. So earned media, email, social media, paid advertising, SMS. And I work really closely with our development department because we're a membership organization. So I help manage all of our digital fundraising. And I feel like my quest answer is so not as fun as everybody else's, but it's probably just top of mind because I actually got back last night from a vacation where I took a little mini trip to Montgomery and Selma, Alabama, which are two places I'd never been before and have always wanted to go to check out the history, and was actually there on Sunday, which was the 57th anniversary of the Voting Rights March over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was very cool to be there for that. And there were a bunch of speakers, including Kamala Harris and Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. So that was my most recent quest.
I think that's a pretty awesome answer, Carl, in comparison to me watching Never-Ending Story with my children on the couch this weekend. So Matt, you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So yeah, my name is Matt Derby. I work at M&R. He, him, his, and I'm a senior vice president. I work on our advertising team. So I worked with, I think, for the organizations I work with, were involved in the last sort of iteration of this project. And my favorite quest, I feel like mine's really boring now, is my personal quest to find the best New York slice, which is an ongoing and never-ending quest. I would say current favorite is Joe's in the West Village on Carmine Street.
Thanks for the hot tip, Matt. And absolutely. I know, I also have to say, we were intending to have Shay Lindley join us from March of Dimes today as well. And unfortunately, she had a last minute emergency and isn't able to make it. So you'll be chatting with myself, Carla, and Matt today. And I will also just know, for those of you who, I saw there were a lot of people who clearly seemed to already guess who you saw on that opening screen, but correct, Galaxy Quest. Throughout, we're going to have a few quest references. So feel free when you see them show up to guess in the chat which quest you're looking at. And if you have questions for us as we go through the conversation today, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to land a question for us that you would like us to address. You're welcome to use chat as well, but we'll be also, some M&R colleagues of ours are on to help address questions over chat and Q&A, Madeline and Michael Ward in particular. So I am gonna go ahead and share my screen here for you. So first, I just wanted to, before we get started, give just a couple of moments of introduction to M&R. So M&R is a team of communicators, marketers, fundraisers, campaigners, and we all work at M&R to help unleash the power of people to do good. We work exclusively with nonprofits, and we are proud to be a unionized firm as well. We have helped each year nonprofits raise hundreds of millions of dollars and generate millions of actions for their missions and build a really thriving digital audience. And these are just a few of the organizations that we're really fortunate to get to work with day in and day out. And a lot of people also know us for our annual benchmarking study. The latest version is chugging down the tracks your way right now, and we'll be reaching you near the end of April. So just about a month and a half to wait till you have a hot new benchmarks in your hands.
Yes, and so today we are here to talk about Scout Quest, where it came from and how it works, and then we'll have a quick discussion with Carla and ourselves about the actual lived experience and making sure that we're filling in some info about how logistically everything works before we'll open up some time for some questions. But first, we're going to put up another round of What's That Quest? So some folks might be familiar with Scout from other interactions with M&R, but in case we're going to give a quick, brief background on just Scout overall. I haven't seen it in the, all right, so you can feel free if you know this quest to put in chat. That's correct. Brian just answered it's Mythic Quest. Thanks, Brian Devine. All right, so Scout is our proprietary data system, and it has a few iterations that, again, some you might have heard of before that we've had running for the last few years. That includes Scout Reports, Scout Ads, and Scout ROI. And on the next slide, this is what a Scout reporting dashboard looks like. And so the goal of Scout for us has always been to get something that we were never able to really quite find ready-made before, which is a nonprofit oriented reporting dashboard that allowed for both the kind of day of up-to-date numbers that are really essential in an emergency, combined with big picture views that are really essential for strategic decisions, and again with a nonprofit oriented slant. So making sure that things like monthly revenue we're able to talk about both up to date and in an ongoing way.
So that brings us to Scout Quest. And just to give you like a little backstory of what Scout Quest is and how we came to create it, working with a lot of large organizations with their email programs. I think anyone who works in digital marketing now is very familiar with this experience that there's a large portion of email files that are just not really responsive. And it's hard to know amongst that giant unresponsive pool who you could actually continue to stay in touch with, particularly as deliverability concerns become greater and greater over time, and to know what to contact them with in order to re-engage those individuals. And meanwhile, we know there's tons of data out there, and if we could leverage that data in a meaningful way, we could then actually create marketing that is more effective and meaningful for our audience. Thanks for the earring call out also. And we did also want to be able to bring more data to bear in a way that was both ethical and secure as well. And so that led to Scout Quest, M&R's new data co-op, where participants share email deliverability indicators, fundraising data, and advertising audiences. I will say over the last about year and a half, M&R's convened periodic data co-ops among our clients. They've been really focused on sharing these specific set of metrics between organizations. And the results have actually been really dynamite. So much so that we've now given it a name, Scout Quest, and we are inviting a limited number of nonprofits to participate in the next round. Scout Quest has been super helpful for participating organizations in a number of ways. One definitely is in identifying people who are good candidates to re-engage over email, and others really in advertising targeting. Through Scout Quest, we've been able to safely reactivate tens of thousands of supporters on different organizations' email files. And some have seen more than 10-to-1 return on that work in just a few months. That's revenue specifically brought in from people that they reactivated using the co-op data. On top of that, Scout Quest also offers custom lookalike audiences for ad targeting built from the full co-op data set. And for those who were using those audiences at end of year, this past year, the average participant had a 26% improvement in cost per acquisition and a 78% improvement in return on ad spend relative to their typical prospect audiences. And I have a feeling there's going to be some people who know this one based off of the many favorites that were mentioned earlier, hint, hint. So here's another time for you to guess in the chat what quest you're looking at here. Right away, Brian is on it. Yes, Tribe Called Quest. You were hearing their delightful music in the intro as well if you joined. So in terms of how it all works, quick overview, there's a few steps of the process. First, letting us know that you're interested in participating on the website at quest.mrss.com, or talking to, if you're a current M&R client, your client team at M&R. Then you would then review the requirements and sign an agreement or confirm with your existing M&R team that you'd like to participate. At that point, you provide all the participants submit their subscriber data. And then we take on step 4, which is comparing all those lists, normalizing all that giant data submission, and creating those advertising lookalikes and generating individual dashboards for each participating organization. Those dashboards will explain a bit more, but they'll have a bunch of data points that will tell you how much overlap there is between your subscriber file and that of the other organizations that are participating in the co-op. You can then use that to select what data you specifically want to purchase at a subscriber level after reviewing the match rates for your dashboard. And then you receive back a whole set of valuable data on match supporters that you select. And you can, if you choose to access the premium advertising tier, access those lookalike audiences for ads targeting. And then finally, using the data to do a bunch of email reactivation, ad targeting, and raising more money for your cause and motivating more activists. So that's really where we want to move over into starting more of a Q&A, and I am gonna stop sharing my screen.
Excellent. So just to start with, I think, Carla, would you be willing to share with us, just a description of your participation? So just a little bit about what we've done with M&R on this sort of co-op project before and what that involved.
Yeah, so we participated twice. The first year we just shared the email data, and then the second year was email data and also data that we could use in the advertising segment. Do you want me to go through sort of what we did with the data once we get it back, or should we hold the nitty gritty?
Well, I guess to start with, what was the main draw? What were you hoping to get out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jessica sort of talked about it at the outset, right? We had this, over the years, our inactive file was just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And, the hope is that there's still some people in there that maybe want to be engaged, or maybe they, got busy for a while, but they might want to be back engaged again. And this gave us a way to reach back into that file and try to re-engage some of those folks that were sort of in the high likelihood of getting back involved. From my perspective, I was looking at it from the perspective of lead gen, right? Like I was comparing, is the cost for this participating in this project going to be comparable to the cost that I might pay for names through Care2 or Daily Codes or some other lead gen source? And so I just took the money out of that budget to do this the first time we participated.
Great. I mean, I think that then, Carla, let's get into talking about results too. And Matt and I will share results that we've seen for other organizations too, but I'm curious to hear from you of on that point of reactivating email subscribers, how has that gone for you?
Yeah, let me pull up my results. So the first time we participated, it's sort of like, I don't want to compare this to data appends, but it's sort of like a data append in that my assumption going in was the first time we participate, I'm going to get the best bang for my buck, right? And then the second, I likely pulled out the cream from the crop, and the second time I participate, I expected the results to be not quite as awesome, which is true, but they were still better than, the cost per name was still better than what I would normally pay. So the first time we participated, within the first month, we reactivated 7.8% of the people that we tried to engage. So 7.8% of the people who were in our inactive file clicked on at least one of the emails and got themselves back into the active file. This happened right at the beginning of December. No, it happened towards the end of December. So we also were able to send the people that we were trying to reactivate one email appeal as part of our December fundraising series. We didn't get them on the file, unfortunately, quickly enough in order to be able to send them our full series of fundraising appeals, or I think we would have converted more of those new folks into donors. But the conversion rate was 0.02% of the people who got one fundraising appeal converted within that first month of December. Then we looked at those same people 6 months on, and 75% were still in the active file. So that was super, that made me really happy. And 2.6% of them had 6 months in given a donation. And then 1 year on, 61% are still active, and 2.8% have made a donation. We also have an activist network. So 11% of the people we re-engaged have taken at least one action or RSVP'd to attend one event within the last year. So I was pretty pleased with those results. And then the second year we just wrapped up, so it hasn't been that long yet, but about 2.2% of the people we tried who had been inactive that we tried to re-engage clicked, and 20% opened at least one message, which we didn't track those two things separately last year because opens was a whole different ballpark a year ago, but now we're tracking them differently and treating those two audiences a little bit differently.
Yeah, yeah. And that actually, I think, was one of the follow-up questions I had for you too, Carl, is like, I think that how you treat inactives is something that's been, how you identify inactives and what you do when you identify someone as an inactive is different between organizations. But for you all at this point, how does this relate to like your inactivity guidelines that you use for list hygiene?
Yeah, so the first year that we did it a year ago, we just had one inactive file, and anybody who clicked on any of these messages or opened any of these messages was considered back in the active file. If they then didn't open any messages for another 6 months, they'd fall inactive again. But if they kept clicking, they'd stay active. Now we have sort of two inactive files. We have people who have only opened an email message, and we send them far fewer messages. And we just basically once a month try to get them to like do something other than just open the email. And then we have our more active file, which is people who are clicking and taking action, which is obviously much, much smaller.
Yeah. And then how does that, like all those metrics that you mentioned is super helpful. How does that compare to when you were talking about thinking about it through the lens of other lead generation that you've pursued?
Yeah, so both rounds, the cost per reactivated name was much cheaper than our average cost per name for lead gen. Even the second time around when we'd already sort of pulled off the most likely to re-engage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I will say for, I don't know, Matt, if you have experience too, but for some of the organizations that I work with, that like being able to get email activity out of the people that you acquire through lead gen is in and of itself a trick. And I found there's a great degree of difference also between the method that people come into file, like a Facebook lead gen versus a daily post, which would be like promoted via email. So those are people who came in via email. And for the data here, because you're actually finding out that they are interacting with email for a nonprofit cause, it stands to follow that they have a higher propensity of like follow through after that point of acquisition too.
I have a question from the audience, guys, around, I think, Carly, you mentioned that it was much cheaper. And I just wondered if the questioner asked, can you give an idea of what much cheaper means to you? Is it a % decrease or what?
Yeah, I can definitely share the numbers. So the first time we did it, where did I write this down? My cost per reactivated name was 17 cents. And the second time, the cost per name that clicked was $1.75, and the cost per name for opens was 17 cents again.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that for cost for acquisition and lead gen, I think in benchmark study last year, amongst all of the data that we gathered, it was in the sort of like $2 range is a pretty typical, like how much you would pay to add a new non-donor email subscriber to your file. So I know we see a lot of range in that metric for the organizations we work with too.
Yeah, and I know I saw in chat that there was a question about it being a lead generation tool, and so right, like in the fall, we first started adding in the lookalike audience options into that, and yeah, and so I think what's been really interesting, and I know Carla, you know, I've gone back and forth about some of those decisions, is that essentially every single organization that we worked with chose to use those in different ways. Most of them, and like we did for UCS, chose to use that for fundraising rather than for lead gen efforts. And so, you know, and I don't know, Carla, if you want to talk a little bit about what you've seen from Facebook overall. I think it's relatively similar. Having seen the first round of our benchmarks results, that I think we're seeing a lot of organizations have trouble with Facebook, and so I don't know if you want to talk at all about yeah, what choices that we made with in terms of those audiences with UCS, but I can then talk a little bit about some other organizations.
Yeah, that'd be great. So full disclosure, I sort of ran the email side of this, doing all the data coding and imports and everything, but M&R ran the sort of ads side of this for us. So Matt knows a lot more of the nitty gritty details on the ad side than I do. But what we basically did was we loaded into our Facebook Audiences Managers account all of the data, and then used that to create lookalike audiences. And like Matt said, use that for fundraising ads. And these were folded into the prospect ads that we were already running. And because we wanted to optimize the ads, we didn't segment them out, which is only frustrating because it means we can't really see like how did these segments perform compared to other segments. But had we segmented them out, the performance would have been much worse. So I think we decided to Matt, tell me if this is inaccurate, but I think we decided to like scrap the ability to see really nitty gritty detail in exchange for trying to get the ads to perform as good as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And that's been, I think, an ongoing decision with Facebook audiences in general. And it's, you know, part of why we would like to try to expand beyond just Facebook. Facebook does make it kind of easy to share those audiences. And so I know there's an answer in the question in the chat about the model email addresses from those lookalikes is just for advertising, and that's correct. In the last round, we were just doing for Facebook. So we're not actually sharing anyone's email addresses with each other. We're just sharing that modeled audience for advertising. But again, because of the difficulty sometimes that you see with Facebook, right, we were doing a lot of combining audiences. And so some groups took those co-op modeled lookalikes, they separated, they targeted a group of co-op lookalikes and then compared that to normal. Some groups threw it in together with their normal targeting, like Carla said. Some took an individual audience and had a different ad set for every single audience. So what's really interesting is how differently every organization sort of approached using those. And again, I think one thing that has stood out is that so far, I'm off the top of my head, I don't know if anyone actually has used it for lead gen, which would be another approach.
There's another question from the audience. Carla, how do you merge the data into your email system so you can use it for segmenting?
Yeah, that's a good question. So basically the first year, the data that you get back tells you sort of how much the people are clicking on other organizations' lists. And so the first year we pulled the data apart and sort of, I broke the data into two groups. One was UCS inactives who were highly engaged and clicking a lot on other organizations' lists. And then everybody else who was like, they're in our inactive file, they've clicked a little on other people's lists, but they're not clicking all the time. And then we tried a couple different approaches. And in the end, what we found was it didn't really matter. If they were clicking on anybody's list, high or low, they basically performed the same. So the first year I did a lot more work than I probably needed to because I wanted to see like, is there, and I don't want to, we didn't want to risk our deliverability tanking by emailing a whole bunch of people who were unresponsive. But the second year, because we saw that there was no difference.
Quick follow-up, Carla, what email marketing tool are you using?
Reaction. Thanks, Madeline. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the second year, I basically took the whole file, I imported them all into the system with just I just put an activist code on their record saying like, these are people who are, you know, M&R co-op names who are active on other people's lists, and then rolled out a series of messages to those people over a 2-week period. So we did an action alert, a newsletter with like a bazillion things to click on, a survey, and then a fundraising appeal to try to give them lots of opportunities to engage in various ways.
And I was going to ask this as a follow-up: do you think that's why the second round seemed to perform better than the first round? I heard a similar. I thought that was also really interesting that there wasn't, you know, that I heard that from other organizations as well.
Yeah, I was really surprised. It was very not what I anticipated. It was certainly much easier. Also because the other reason why the second round was easier is because the pool was smaller. The first round we had I had to break out. We didn't want to send an email. We didn't want to send an email to inactive people of more than 10,000. So I had to break the potential reactivation pool into 10 groups of 10,000 each, and then each day send them an email message. And I had to time it so that the days those were going out weren't days when we were sending other messages. So that I didn't want to risk messing up the deliverability of the actual messages we were sending to our active file. So the timing, making the plan actually was probably the most cumbersome piece of it, to just try to figure out how do you time this so that you don't mess up the other emails that you're sending, and so that you give these people enough opportunity to engage, ideally before your end of year series starts to go out, so that everybody who's going to maybe engage is engaged by the time you hit them up for fundraising.
Yeah, and I will note too, that was one of the things that changed between rounds, is that when we first started running the data co-op, open your data was more reliable. And so we were including organizations' open information. And in the last round, we really honed it into clicks, knowing that opens are not as reliable as they once were. And so that means you get a smaller pool, but a more qualified pool, essentially. And then Carl, how did you choose what content to use for your reactivation approach?
Yeah, it mostly had to do with what was happening at the time. So it was a sort of a combination of what's timely, what people are like hearing about in the news right now that they're likely to be interested in, and also what have we sent recently that performed well with our current audience. We were lucky this year, we had a couple options. Last year, I think I was reaching out to program folks and saying, please, can you let me rework this action alert to make it a little more timely so that we can resend it, because I've got this new pool of people I need to engage. Whereas this year we had a little bit more actually happening out of the programs to choose from, so it wasn't quite as difficult. But mostly we just wanted to pick a variety of things in case there were people in there who, you know, were responsive to the action alert, but not the newsletter, or vice versa.
We've got another question from the audience, which is, I think, for all three of you, so you can decide who might answer, but what's the relative importance of good prospects versus effective messaging for a successful re-engagement? In parentheses, engagement.
That is a very good question. I think that, like, I don't know, and maybe three of us would each have a different answer to that question, but I think that well, I feel like you can't reactivate without the pool of people to reactivate. So it is a necessary requirement to have that piece. But I have definitely seen that the content that you use can have a huge impact on the quality of the results that you get. And you think about this just from a welcome series perspective. If you've used different messaging in a welcome series and you look at what of those messages generate the greatest number of clicks or activity, there's a big difference in the kind of content. I think a lot of the organizations that are activist oriented or participate in advocacy in any way often find that advocacy content tends to be a high click getter. So in terms of just from straight trying to move the maximum number of people into a pool of people who have identified as will click on content, that tends to be one of the first places that I work with organizations to go to if that's on the table as an option. Obviously, fundraising content has a different purpose generally, like nothing like an appeal will actually get people to give, but it doesn't have the same kind of click-through rate that you'll get for advocacy.
Yeah, I would reiterate that. For us, at least, action alerts are always going to get the most clicks, and we often do raise a fair amount of money through post-action fundraising asks. So after somebody takes an action, landing them on a fundraising form. So that is a good way for us to try to convert them to a donor when they're most engaged. And I would say the one thing that at least for us, I think has been important for us to think about is not just what's the action alert that's going to get the most people to take action right now, but also is sort of core to who we are, because we've often sometimes had like something really, it's in the news, it's getting a lot of attention, it's all over social media right now, and I know I'm going to get a really high response rate if I send this alert out, but it's not actually something that we have a long-term strategic campaign plan on, and these people who take this action aren't going to hear from us again on this issue potentially for another like year. And so the likelihood that they're going to take action is high, but then they're just going to fall off the list. And those aren't the people that I want. So I'm much more likely to do an alert that I think this is timely and it's urgent, and hopefully they're going to be into it, but it's like super core science-based work that they're going to hear about from us on an ongoing basis. And so hopefully these are the people that will stick with us long-term.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think, just to reiterate that, I think the real key is that engagement creative is different than you might use for prospecting. I think we see this a lot, whether it's in fundraising or lead gen, that the kind of thing that you need to talk about to get someone's attention for the first time is different than someone who's already familiar with you or they know about you, and you need to convince them to be an ongoing supporter. Those like tend to be different, both topics and different ways of talking about your organization.
I also wanted to ask too, just sort of like on the logistics side for you, Carla, like how much was involved for you to participate, and what kind of process you needed to go through within your organization to get approval to move forward, especially knowing that a piece of this is sharing a whole bunch of data that's extremely valuable and sensitive.
Yeah, the first time, I think the data privacy and the budget are the two things, right? So the first time, like I said, since it's my lead gen budget and I was choosing to spend a portion of it on this, I just went ahead with it. From the data privacy perspective, because we aren't sharing any specific supporter contact information that these organizations don't already have, right? Because you're only getting information for the people who are already on your file. So from a donor, going back and rereading our privacy policy, I didn't have any concerns about the privacy issues, because we weren't sharing, all we were sharing was information about how active these people are. We weren't sharing information that other organizations didn't already have about these people in terms of their contactability, their contact info. The second time around, because there was an additional piece around the digital advertising component, which was an additional expense. And it was around fundraising, which is a different budget that I don't control. I had to reach out to the development department to say, hey, we have this opportunity. Here's what it costs. Here's what it would cost. Here's what I think we would potentially get from it. I think it's a good opportunity that we should consider, but I did have to pull in some more people to have a little bit of a conversation about that.
We have two related questions from the audience, and then we might move into logistics, because I know there's lots of logistic questions. And they're really quite related, which is thinking about, you have this big group of inactives, and is there a benefit to just emailing them every 6 months or so? And then what do you do with these inactives? Do you sunset them if they don't respond either to these new re-engagement tactics, or just emailing them once every so often? What do you do with those?
Well, this is where I wish Anne, our deliverability expert, was here. Because, yeah, I mean, I will say after we did this the first time, there was a part of me that was like, why don't I just reach out to these people once in a while? Like, clearly, a lot of them are like ready to re-engage, and maybe we should. But up until that point, sort of our rule of thumb was always that we don't, because unless there's something new and really big, then maybe we would consider it. But generally speaking, once you're inactive, we're not reaching back out to you unless you proactively re-engage again. But I do think it's a good question, and maybe we should think about whether there are particular moments and when it makes sense to try to potentially re-engage these folks again.
I think that's interesting because I walking through annually benchmarks numbers with different organizations, it feels like every year there's a different set who run into the deliverability problem to like the big degree, like you have that year. And that's, I think, where a lot of that comes from is, right, like that the danger is all of a sudden your server starts getting flagged because you're emailing people who said they didn't want to get emails or that are actually spam traps or whatever they are, and then you have to just, the only way to deal with it is just setting those really strict rules. And so I think whether it's something that had happened 4 years ago or 3 years ago or last year, I do feel like a lot of organizations that we work with have gotten to that place for one reason or another.
Yeah, and I think I will note too that when we're looking at like through the co-op, we're identifying from that giant group of inactives, like who has the most potential, and basically that mitigating the risk of deliverability problems. And I can say, like, I think from the last round, on average, we, of all of the full file people submitted, which included their full data set, subscribed, unsubscribed, inactive, active, about on average 8% of the individuals on any one organization's list were people we identified as have clicked for another organization, but not you, in the last 12 months. So you can imagine that's like, it's a percentage of what is a very large pool of inactives. So if you went out to that whole pool, the risk factor is definitely very different. Though I think, as Carla was noting, taking a more granular approach to like how we manage our files and who to include or exclude or how frequently to contact people, I think is like a increasingly big part of managing an email program, because you want to maximize the value from all the people that you have collected over time, but also minimize any potential damage that could have a long-term effect while you have to rehabilitate your reputation for deliverability purposes.
Can I jump in with one additional thought that I just remembered? The other factor, just to share to the extent that it's useful for folks in thinking about whether to participate, was time. Like, how much of a time commitment is this going to take from me to manage this? So again, I was mostly just sort of the hands-on managing of the email side of things, and Matt and his folks were handling the ad side. But I did go back and look, and it was about 10 hours over the course of about a month and a half of my time to help pull the data, then import it back in the system, code it, run a little analysis, make the plan, send all the email messages, and then do the analysis after the fact. So at the time, it felt like a pretty big commitment, but 10 hours in the scheme of things over a month and a half is actually not. When I saw that, I was like, oh, that really wasn't that big a lift.
Very precise. I think that what I'll do now is just move us over to just sharing some of the logistics. And if we have a few minutes after that, we can answer any other additional questions. And again, you're also welcome to reach out to us directly after this to ask questions too. We're happy to address those as well. So give me 1 second. I will share my screen. And there's another opportunity to guess what quest you're seeing here. Oh, Brian, I feel like you get a gold star for today. Clearly you were up on your quest knowledge. Vision Quest is correct. So just getting into the brass tacks of how it's going to work for this year. We are going to be running the co-op twice during the year, once in the spring with data submission at the end of April, and then another round in the fall with data submission at the end of September. So you can sign up at any time, but signing up before the spring round gives you 2 opportunities to get data back during the year, as well as the opportunity to access a full year's worth of advertising audiences. And so what do you get back? Every participant receives a dashboard back that details a whole bunch of information. It includes how many other lists your subscribers appear on, and how many other organizations' messaging your subscribers are clicking on, how many of your subscribers have clicked for another organization but not yours in the last year, how many of your donors are giving to other organizations in various time increments, 12 months, 13 to 24 months, 25 plus, similar data point for prospects, and then how many of your donors are giving to other organizations as a monthly donor, and again, similar data point for prospects. You then, when you get that dashboard, have the option to purchase subscriber specific data, and you can choose all match data, or you could choose some specific cut of data that you want. So that might be the subscribers that are clicking for other organizations, not yours. That's particularly good for reactivation. Maybe you just want the data back for the donors on your file who happen to match, and that could be helpful for donor reactivation and targeting. Or also just subscribers giving to other organizations, but not to yours, which again could be good for donor acquisition targeting. For any of those categories, you get a whole bunch of data points against those specific individuals. And so those data points include things like the number of organizations in the co-op that this individual appears on, and which cohorts of nonprofits. So cohorts being like environmental groups or wildlife and animal welfare groups, any cohort that we have sufficient quantity of participation to be able to identify. And then also includes the number of organizations that they've clicked on email for in the last year, the number of organizations they've made a donation to in those various time windows, the number of organizations they make a monthly gift for, and the highest previous contribution that individual has made in those various time windows as well.
One question about the data, and then I think and just want to remind folks they can ask questions in the chat for Carla, Matt, and Jessica. But one person asked, does the data that you get suggest the level of giving to other organizations?
Yeah, the last data point is the highest previous contribution that individual has made to any of the organizations in the co-op in the last 12 months. What's their highest previous contribution, and highest contribution in the last 13 to 24 months, and highest contribution in 25 plus months.
And then I also saw a question from Tiffany, which is how large of an email file, how large does the email file need to be in order to benefit from the co-op? I didn't know if Jessica or Carla, you had any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have tried to structure it so that it can scale for the size of the list that you're submitting for the co-op. So we'll get there in a second. There's like a clear layout of costs associated, but entry into the co-op and to get that dashboard is $2,000 for the year. And so then at that point, you pay based off of the number of matched records that you want back. And so if you have a smaller file, you have a smaller number of match records, the pricing scales against that.
Then I see a question about lookalikes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the lookalikes that we built, and then I'm going to actually answer the question. So yeah, so in addition, right, we also are able to use the data that we get to generate lookalike audiences. So we are able to build seed lists from the participating organizations, and we can then create a variety of types of audiences to serve as the base for lookalikes. We, in the past, have tried a couple different permutations. I think the last time around, we said around 18 different audiences, and mostly we found that people did not find having that many different options useful. So we are creating 3 different categories of lookalikes, and within each of those categories, you'll get a few different versions of a lookalike. So for example, if a donor lookalike would be a lookalike of the donors of every participating organization. whereas a high value donor lookalike would be perhaps just $1,000 plus donors. And again, we're not sharing that combined audience, we're sharing a lookalike of that audience. So we're not usually sharing your donors to be directly targeted or providing the actual donor lists. It leverages the data to build a lookalike audience. And so Beth asked if we can talk a little bit about the differences that we saw in those lookalike audiences versus the sort of normal audience that we're using. The stat that we showed was a 78% improvement over existing audiences. So correct, that does not just include, so what we were comparing to were the overall audience performances. So that mostly included lookalikes based off of donor files from an existing organization, along with interest targeting. We did include interest targeting in that comparison. So whatever the sort of existing best performers were, that's how we're trying to make that comparison. And so one quick note about privacy. Again, this gets really important, but we don't keep this data past the round. We're not actually sharing any personally identifiable information from one organization to another. You only receive data for supporters that you already have. It's really the purpose is to enhance that data, not to share organizations' data between each other. And that's both true for the lookalike and for the email information.
And then just a quick overview on the cost factor I mentioned a little bit. Oh, shoot. I mentioned previously the enrollment fee. So the $2,000 enrollment fee is waived for M&R clients. You can enroll by April 11th and participate in both the spring and fall rounds, or you can enroll between April 11th and September 12th to participate in only the fall round. Then once you have that dashboard back in both rounds, you can decide what you would like to actually get subscriber-specific data around, and you pay based off of what you're choosing from there. If you wanted all matched records, it's 3 cents per record. If you want specific audiences within that greater pool, they're priced at 15 cents per record. And then the premium advertising tier enrollment is $9,500 for access to the lookalike audiences through May 30th of 2023. So basically a full year of access to those. They will get refreshed in the fall round with the new set of data, but you would gain access for both the current and then the refreshed fall ones if you joined at this point. And one last Quest guess. Oh, Christina beating out Brian. Right. Yes. Questlove. Excellent. I know that was also one that was mentioned as a favorite among some people at the very beginning too. So I'm not surprised to see some people jump on that one. So in terms of just next steps, what happens from here, there's a bunch more information available on our website at quest.mrss.com. That's also where you can indicate your interest, enter in your email. There's a brief form with just a couple of questions, and we'll follow up with you from that. There's also an FAQ there and a bunch more information you can access. You're also welcome to email us directly at scoutquest@mrss.com, and we will get back to you via that. And with that, I will...
We have a couple questions for you already lined up, panelists.
Great.
So there's some questions about US versus international. So does the data you have on donor activity at other orgs include Canadian orgs? And is it limited to the US? Is it GDPR compliant for EU, UK?
Yeah, it is almost certainly not GDPR compliant. That would require us to really significantly change how we handled it, because we are handling the data. That handling, even though we're not sharing it or distributing it, makes it not GDPR compliant, even though it is compliant with US privacy laws. So unfortunately, the EU is likely not a good option. Right now, we haven't had any Canadian organizations participate previously, but that does not mean that they cannot. Whether if it would be useful for Canadian organizations to participate, then I would say we'd love to have them to join. But so far it hasn't. It's been limited.
And another one for you. How do you manage the potential competition of names within the co-op? What overlap is expected for names across multiple orgs?
I would say I took a look at sort of like what was the average match rate from last time. It's obviously going to vary based on who's participating in each round of the co-op and how potentially aligned your acquisition strategies are relative to those other organizations. But the range in the last was quite big. So there were organizations that had like a 2% match against their full file, and others that got all the way up to 23% of their file overlapped with any other organization in the co-op. On average, though, it was about 12% in terms of overlap.
One more clarification question from Matt, not Matt Derby. Just to clarify, are you building the lookalike audience, or is Facebook building the lookalike built on the participants' enriched data?
Yeah, good question. So we are building the input audience, and then Facebook then builds the lookalike based on that input audience. In the future, when we add additional targeting to other channels, so especially display, that would likely change. So we'd probably end up doing more of the building either ourselves or with a third-party data provider.
Got a question, another question, which is, how does regionality affect smaller organizations? Is the data of local organization compared to national information, or can it be compared against other local organizations and subscribers in the area?
So I think that ultimately the data you submit is the only data that would get matched against. So if your audience is regional in nature, you're not going to get data that's non-regional in nature. It's going to be enhanced against your existing data set. That said, for the lookalike, that's a little bit different in that the lookalike is against the full submission. So that would be nationalized. I don't know, Matt, if you want to add anything to that.
Right, but then you could then target only, if for instance, you were a hospital operating in a certain city, you could then only target, you could use those lookalikes to and then limit geographically who you wanted to recruit from. I think the only other thing I would mention is one of the things that stood out to me was, you do get a report of how your names overlap with other places. And I always think that ends up challenging assumptions around who our donors are, or who our supporters are, and where I can include where they come from. There's sometimes more overlap than we expect with non-similar organizations, and then less overlap than we expect with similar organizations, I think, is what I have generally seen from the results so far.
I have two more questions. One is, will participants be able to see what other orgs are participating to see how many are in their sector?
Yeah, we specifically don't share the names of the participating organizations. So there's no publicized list of which organizations are including their data for privacy reasons. We won't include a cohort unless there's sufficient volume within that cohort. So we won't tell you which organizations are in the cohort, but inclusion of that cohort means that we had sufficient volume, that it isn't just like a couple of organizations' files.
And then we have another question that is very smart, not stupid, Jeanette. That was answered. I see Michael just answered in the chat, but for this to be able to work, you have to be able to export your list with data about who is opening, clicking, and donating.
Yeah, I mean, we're not actually collecting open data at this point, so that's the one exclusion from that list. But yes, clicking, donating. The other piece I would add is their subscription status. So if you we'll want to be able to know who's unsubscribed, specifically so that if you are electing to pay for data back, we're not giving you subscribers who you can't actually email because they are technically unsubscribed from your file.
We have two last questions that I hope we can answer pretty quickly, and then we're going to have to wrap up because we've reached our time. But one is, do you think there's a limit on effectiveness for regional-based nonprofits of using the co-op?
Well, I will be totally upfront and say that I think to date, all participants have been national organizations. So I don't think that we have like a direct experience with a prior participant who was regional in nature. That said, I think that it really depends on how much matching you get out of your program, out of your file, and depending on how you've grown your program and whatnot, there may be more or less matching for you.
I'll also say that one of the benefits of the combined lookalike is that you get to build lookalikes that you might not be able to build if you just had your own organization. So because you might not have enough $1,000 plus donors to make $1,000 plus lookalike audience. And so this is one of the benefits for small organizations.
And I'm afraid we're at time and no more time for questions.
Thank you all for joining, especially huge thanks for Carla for joining us, for Matt and I today. And feel free to reach out with any questions that we didn't answer. We're happy to try and get answers back to you. And you can keep an eye out on Scout on our website for more information as well.